In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a technological revolution was taking place in Britain. Bit by bit, a newfangled concept known as the railway was taking shape, ultimately culminating in the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the first fully mechanised passenger railway in the world. But while this was going on, innovators from all over the world were watching with great interest. It would not take long for the concept to spread abroad. The first tracks in the area which would become the United States were built in Lewiston, just below Niagara Falls, in 1763. Sledges running on rails were used to ease the task of dragging goods up to the top of the river buffs. Here they joined the Niagara Portage. A second set of tracks would be used to lower trucks down to the docks, lashed together with a pulley so the one would counterweight the other. In a sign of things to come, the tracks heightened tensions between the Caucasian settlers and the indigenous Seneca. It was part of a wider scheme to encourage settlement in the area by improving transport links, which until then had relied on ancient trails and Seneca porters. Indeed, 200 Seneca had previously been employed at Lewiston to carry goods up the buffs. The Seneca did not take kindly to the loss of employment and bladed attempt to displace them. They joined in Pontiac's war and ambushed the first convoy to make use of the system, killing 102 people. The early wagonways in America were short both in size and in lifespan, typically built for the transfer of large quantities of building material for particular projects, and dismantled once the building project was complete. However, more permanent railways were taking shape. In 1809, a man called Thomas Leaper was looking for a better means of moving stone from his quarries to the docks on Ridley Creek. He designed a canal, but couldn't get planning permission to build it. Instead, he began to look into building a wagonway, running on wooden rails. He conducted experiments in which he was able to pull 10,000 pounds, 4,500 kilos, with a single horse. A year later, he built a track, 3/4 of a mile, 1.2 kilometres long. This was America's first wagonway intended to be permanent. It greatly streamlined the rate at which stone could be moved. However, it shut in 1828, when he was finally able to get permission to build his canal. The first permanent wagonway was a granite railway designed by Gridley Bryant in 1826, set up to move stone for the Bunker Hill Memorial, but anyone with a vehicle capable of running on the tracks could do so for a fee. In 1830, it was expanded with an inclined section to move full trucks down from Pine Ledge Quarry. This section still stands and is the oldest preserved piece of track in America. The line introduced a number of innovations, such as switch tracks or points, turntables, and double-bogeyed trucks. Bryant could have made a lot of money patenting these ideas, but chose not to, believing they should be freely available to foster growth in the system as a whole. Many other similar lines began to spring up across the country, using various combinations of horses, winches, and gravity to move trucks and lighter passenger services. In 1832, the world's first urban streetcar service began in New York. At the time, the city had few paved roads, and the streets could turn into a quagmire in the winter. And so, the city laid tracks in the streets, laying rails down the middle of 4th Avenue as far as 32nd Street, dug into the road to avoid inconveniencing other road users. Even in paved sections, the tracks greatly reduced the rolling resistance of the streetcars and could travel much faster than the omnibuses which had previously provided public transport. The idea quickly spread in America, where the wide streets and grid layout were ideally suited for streetcars. In 1834, a similar network opened in New Orleans. The network there has been running ever since, going through several forms of motive power, making it the oldest tram network in the world. When the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in Britain in 1825, it got observers interested in the concept of steam locomotives. But as in Britain, the concept was somewhat experimental. The final implementation of steam power on America's railroads would go through several false starts. One man watching Britain's development of steam transportation with great interest was Colonel John Stevens. In 1802, he built America's first steamboat, a great boost to travel due to North America's abundance of navigable rivers. He then set his mind to running similar transports on land. As early as 1815, he had been granted a charter for the construction of railroads in New Jersey, and had many plans for lines in the state, but he was never able to secure the funding to get any of them built. In 1825, he designed a prototype in the hope of gaining publicity. He built a circular section of track on his estate in Hoboken, New Jersey, on which he ran his steam carriage, the first steam train in North America. Sadly, even this was not enough to secure investment in his wider rail projects. The Delaware and Hudson Canal Company was founded in 1823 to build and operate canals between New York City and the coalfields around Carbondale, Pennsylvania. But the canal could not cover the final 7 miles 11 kilometers to the mines themselves. Instead, they built a railroad to transport the coal from the mines to the docks, which began operation in 1829. The company soon became interested in steam power. Designer Horatio Allen was sent to Britain to gather information about this new technology, and to locate some locomotives suitable to run on the line. He ordered 4 locomotives to be imported from Foster Rastrick and Company, but only one would ever run on the line. Known as the Stourbridge Lion, it would be the first to run on a serving American railroad. After some testing and tinkering in New York, it was brought to the line for its first test run. Though Allen had never driven a locomotive before, he took it out on his own. He successfully completed a run of 3 miles 5 kilometers back and forth, much to the delight of thousands of spectators who gathered to watch. The train performed admirably, but it proved too heavy for the wooden rails, almost double the loading capacity which had been specified. Due to the damage done, it would never run on the line again. The DHCC became reluctant to pursue steam power, and Allen quit the company to pursue his ideas elsewhere. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened, connecting the Hudson River with the Great Lakes, and creating the first navigable waterway to the area above Niagara Falls, with a number of further canals connecting boats to the upper stretches of the Mississippi. This was a great boost in New York, which became the gateway to the country's interior. Nearby Baltimore was now lagging behind, and in need of their own links to the west. Businessmen Philip E. Thomas and George Brown had both been present at the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and decided a similar line was just what Baltimore needed. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad would go west from the city to link up with the Ohio River at Wheeling. It would be double-tracked to facilitate the high flow of goods and passengers. This would be America's first common carrier railroad, open to all traffic, not just goods for a specific company. Building a 380-mile, 611-kilometre railway would be no mean feat, not least because the Allegheny Mountains stood in the way. Proposals to build through the relatively flat ground in Pennsylvania were blocked by the state government, leaving them to follow the rougher route through Maryland and Western Virginia. Construction got underway in 1828, with the ground broken by Charles Carroll, the last surviving signatory of the Declaration of Independence. He later described digging that ground as the second most important thing he'd ever done. Building through the mountains would be tough, and require some bridges which would be quite innovative for the time. The Carrollton Viaduct was built in 1827 and is still in use, making it the oldest rail bridge in America and the third oldest in the world, beaten only by 2 bridges on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. When a branch to Washington was opened in 1835, the Thomas Viaduct was built over the Patapsco River, 612 feet 187 metres long, making it the longest in the US at the time, and one of the first in the world to be built on a curve. Designer Benjamin Latrobe drew criticism from observers, who believed the design would collapse under its own weight, nicknaming it Latrobe's Folly. But the bridge spectacularly proved them wrong, not just staying up, but remaining in place through the Great Flood of 1868 and Hurricane Agnes in 1972, each of which otherwise devastated the Patapsco Valley. Nonetheless, the B&O could only advance westward at a slow pace. By 1830, the first section had opened as far as Ellicott's Mills, but it would not reach the Ohio River until 1852. Due to the steep gradients and windy nature of the line, it was felt impractical for steam, and so the line was initially fully horse-driven. However, circumstances would prove steam's worth. An innovator and philanthropist called Peter Cooper had recognised the value the line would add to land in Maryland and brought whole swathes of it as near as he could to the planned route. He began flattening hills and draining swamps to make way for settlement. Whilst doing so, diggers came across a large reserve of iron ore, which he promptly had mined, knowing that the line would not only provide a fast route to carry his iron to the docks on the markets, but also provide a direct buyer with a great need for large quantities of iron, particularly if he could persuade them about the value of steam power. He kept a quantity of this iron to himself to contribute to his latest project, Tom Thumb, a coffee pot locomotive put together from various odd parts, such as musket barrels and some small-scale steam engines he had fiddled with back in New York. In August 1830, Tom Thumb was ready for a test run, aiming to prove the line was suitable for steam. Tom Thumb was able to traverse the length of the line with ease, hitting speeds of 15 miles an hour, 24 kilometers an hour. On the return journey, Tom Thumb pulled up alongside a horse-driven rail carriage, pulled by one of the company's finest horses. The two challenged each other to a race along the 8 miles, 13 kilometers back to Baltimore. Sources differ on whether this race was pre-planned or was a spontaneous decision. The horse took an early lead, but once the engines got up to speed, it was able to rapidly gain ground, soon shooting out ahead. But then, things went wrong. Tom Thumb was equipped with a mechanical air injector to feed air into the furnace. Its drive belt slipped off, restricting the flow into the fire and bringing the engine to a halt. The horse was able to gallop past. Cooper manoeuvred the belt back into position, lacerating his hand in the process, and set off in pursuit. But by now it was too late to catch up, and the horse reached Baltimore first. Nonetheless, Tom Thumb emerged with a moral victory, proving that steam power could succeed even in the more difficult terrain of America's interior. A year later, the B&O would fully mechanise. However, it was beaten to the title of the first line to run a regular steam passenger service by the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company. The line aimed to link Charleston with the cotton fields to the west of the state. The plantations, who stood to benefit most from the line, leased out a number of slaves for the construction. By 1830, they built the first 6 miles 9 kilometres, but work in the hot Carolina sun proved backbreaking even by slave labour standards. As workers began to drop, the plantations stopped leasing them for fear of having none left to pick the cotton. The company were forced to import 1,500 white labourers to replace them, who were provided better working conditions, and the work resumed. By 1833, the 136-mile, 219-kilometre route was complete. At the time, it was the longest route in the world. Like all early lines, it was initially primarily horse-driven. This included a machine called Flying Dutchman, powered by a horse on a treadmill, capable of carrying 12 passengers. But Horatio Allen was able to persuade the company of the potential of steam engines early on. He argued that horses were as fast and as powerful as they were ever going to be, whereas steam engines had the potential for a great deal of growth. Allen was appointed chief engineer of the line and ordered the construction of an engine in a factory in New York, designed to handle the lighter loading gauge of early American lines. Known as the best friend of Charleston, it pulled its first service on Christmas Day 1830, kicking off the first regular steam rail service outside of Britain. A year later, Best Friend would explode, due to a fireman tying down the safety valve to coax more speed from the engine, though some accounts claim it was because he didn't like the sound it made. The pressure proved too much and the boiler burst, killing the fireman in the process. The engine was repaired and rebranded as Phoenix. In the process, the safety valve was adjusted to make it harder to tamper with. Nonetheless, passengers refused to travel with the engine unless a stack of cotton bales was placed between them and the boiler. In 1831, the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad opened in New York, the first American railroad to be steam-powered from its inception, with an engine called the DeWitt Clinton pulling a train of 3 modified stagecoaches. It was designed to allow passengers and light freight to bypass a section of the Erie Canal where there were a lot of locks. On its first run, it impressed the crowds by covering the distance between Albany and Schenectady in just 38 minutes, a distance the canal would take hours or even days to accomplish. Improvements were happening fast with locomotives. In 1832, the Camden and Amboy Railroad opened between New York and Philadelphia. To run on the line, they purchased a locomotive known as John Bull from Robert Stephenson and Company. Though initially successful, engineers on the line began making improvements which would be more adapted to running in America. Longer journeys were aided by an enclosed driver's cab and tender. A bell and whistle were installed for alerting anyone who might be on the line ahead of the engine, and a headlamp was installed so they could check the way ahead even in the dark. The engine's 040 wheel arrangement had worked well on the straighter British tracks, but on the windier, lower quality tracks in the US, the train would often slip off the rails, and so a leading bogie was added to guide it round bends. This necessitated the removal of the connecting rods between the power wheels, effectively converting the 040 engine into a 420 engine. Because American railroads were on fence for most of their length, they would frequently encounter debris and stray cattle on the line, and so a special wedge known as a cowcatcher was installed to clear away lighter obstructions. Finally, engineers faced an issue that coal was less readily available in America than it was in Britain. Their steam trains would have to rely mostly on burning wood, but wood fires tend to produce a lot of sparks, which were being thrown out of the smokestack. In dry conditions, these could be very hazardous. Engineers designed a diffuser chamber, effectively an enlarged tapered smokestack, in which the sparks would be caught and burn themselves out safely. As more and more lines were built, track 2 was being upgraded. Early lines typically ran on edge rails, wooden or stone blocks, with an iron edge to reduce wear. This limited the loads which could be placed on them, but they were a necessary feature due to the low availability of iron rails. But edge rails rotted quite quickly, diminishing the quality of lines. As iron became more available, companies increasingly began to replace the edge rails with sturdier rolled iron T-rails, allowing for much larger trains to be run. By 1835, railroads were springing up across the country, as far east as Louisiana. Already, they had surpassed the length of track that had been built in Britain. The railroads were there to stay, and they would soon expand, linking together into a full network. Travelling on America's first railways could be a very different experience from travelling in Europe. The first carriages typically consisted of converted stagecoaches, or open trucks with seats and cover installed. They were so lightweight that they would frequently slip off the track, whereupon passengers could be drafted into picking them up and putting them back in place. However, longer journeys demanded something more substantial, and it wasn't long before recognisable boxcars and carriages took shape, fully enclosed to keep out the smoke and the weather. They were placed on double bogies, which allowed longer carriages to handle tighter bends. This created a smoother ride for passengers, and also allowed companies to run trains of the same capacity but with fewer carriages, greatly reducing rolling resistance. Unlike most European coaches, American coaches were open plan right from the start. The longer journeys required passengers to be able to move around for their own comfort. It also allowed them to visit the toilet. Toilet stalls became commonplace in American carriages much sooner than European ones. Nonetheless, journeys were far from comfortable. The seats were bare wood, primitive braking systems made starting and stopping very abrupt, ventilation came from opening a window, heating came from a single stove in the middle of the carriage. Those who wished for a bit of fresh air could step out onto the balconies at either end of the coach. These were equipped with sets of steps for boarding and exiting the train. It was a necessary feature, as early platforms were rarely built at carriage level. More typically, they were an ankle-high platform designed mainly to keep people's feet out of the mud. In many places, there would be no platform at all. Travellers would simply flag trains down on the slower sections of the line. There were no facilities to eat or sleep on early carriages, so special rest stops would be scheduled into the journey to cater to these needs. Hotels would be built on otherwise unoccupied sections of tracks, purely to allow trains to be unloaded for overnight stops, a common requirement in a country as vast as the US. But schedules were often unreliable in the early days, and trains couldn't always reach the planned overnight stops in time. The crew would just stop at the nearest town and leave passengers to seek their own accommodation. Another feature missing in comparison to Britain was any formalised class system. Those with money could pay for a carriage to themselves, but it was a private arrangement, and companies rarely offered designated first and second class tickets. Right from the start, travel would be one size fits all. Of course, US railways did possess one strict divide, and that was race. Even in the supposedly free North, black people would frequently be blocked from sharing carriages with whites. Often, they would be provided with no carriages at all, and would have to travel as best they could in the boxcars and luggage cars. The coming of the railways was a source of a great deal of excitement everywhere they went. Towns which had once been linked only by dirt roads and ancient trails were now opened up to new opportunities. Communication across this vast continent was vastly sped up. Goods could be transported in a fraction of the time and the cost of moving them by road. And while canals were still cheaper, they were much slower. What's more, they would often freeze over in the winter, whereas the railways were easier to keep going in any conditions. Speeding up communication was a great boost to the economy. Farmers, miners and craftspeople had access to a much wider market than they'd had before. Individuals too, who had previously been confined to one town for their whole lives, could make use of these new lines to seek education and opportunities elsewhere. The railways also made it much easier to supply remote areas, greatly boosting settlement. At the start of the century, settlers had moved little beyond the original 13 colonies. Now the first great drive westward was happening, with railways greatly speeding things up. Industrialisation too was sped up, with factories gaining access to the steady supply of raw materials they would need, an easy method of transporting them to the docks and the markets, as well as the ability to recruit workers from much wider areas. As the industry grew, the country's dependence on materials imported from Britain would rapidly decrease. The excitement surrounding the railways was seemingly contagious. More than 200 rail companies sprang up across the country in this time, plotting lines here and there. Their funding came from a variety of means. The American ideal was that they should be privately financed, but in practice, railways could rarely be purely private affairs. Railways are generally unprofitable to run, and provide little direct return to attract investors. Their main selling point is the boost they bring to the local economy. For this reason, funding typically consisted of a mix of private investment and state subsidies. The government in Washington could have provided aid, but the states were suspicious about the concept of direct government intervention. Nonetheless, the government found ways to help out indirectly, such as passing acts promising a remission of import duties of iron imported from Britain, an act which would ultimately be scrapped in 1843 when American iron became more readily available. A more ubiquitous incentive the government could offer was land. Railways were being built through a lot of sparsely populated areas, particularly since the natives had recently been cleared out in the Trail of Tears. A corridor of land close to the line could easily be awarded to the company as valuable real estate. The first land grant was set up for the Tallahassee Railroad Company in Florida in 1835, awarding them 30 feet 9 meters on either side of the line. This land was sold to settlers, with entire towns built in the middle of nowhere. Not only did the company make direct money off the sale of land, but these towns created an extra market for the rail to transport. Once funding was secured, construction could get underway. Whereas British companies depended on dedicated teams and navvies to get their lines built who would move with the company, American companies would grab any cheap source of labour from the surrounding area, with the expectation that they would learn on the job. The inexperienced workforce and lack of health and safety procedures meant that accidents and fatalities were quite common. Not only did they have to deal with standard accidents, but the wilder terrain meant dealing with wild animals, harsh weather and tropical disease. Companies would use the cheapest source of labour available. In the north, this usually consisted of migrants, who would often be recruited straight off the ships. In the south, they had ready access to slave labour. By the time of the Civil War, there were 15,000 slaves working on the railways. The rail companies saw little reason to purchase the slaves and simply rented them from their owners for 1 or 2 year contracts. Contracts they would frequently not survive. Conditions were far worse than for their comrades on the plantations. They were forced to work extra long hours in back-breaking conditions in the hot sun. Alongside workplace accidents, there was the issue of accommodation. They were poorly fed and poorly housed, with shelter rarely consisting of more than tents, sometimes not even that. An observer on the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad described slave accommodation as consisting of a wooden pen with poles holding up a cover. Slaves were kept there with no solid walls, no floor, no beds, no chimney, and no cooking utensils. In these cramped conditions, scarlet fever, malaria, and cholera were rife. Knowing how bad conditions were, some owners refused to lease out their slaves for fear of depleting their own workforce. The companies solved this issue by creating insurance policies. If a slave died, the owners would be nicely compensated for their loss of earnings. Employing slave labour was not the only corner-cutting measure employed to get the railways built as quickly and cheaply as possible. The majority of routes were single-tracked, with passing loops built in at intervals. This required trains to arrive at these loops at the correct times to pass each other by. The problem was, with little communication over long distances, any disruption in the schedules could be quite chaotic. For the staff at each station and junction, their knowledge of what was happening down the line was limited to their line of sight. Often, they would build crow's nests or station lookouts on high vantage points to scan the horizon for signs of smoke. A delayed train could leave those coming the other way waiting all day at a passing loop for a train which might never arrive. On other occasions, they would move on without waiting, believing they could get to the next passing loop first, only to encounter the oncoming train in the middle of the track, leaving the crews to argue about who would have to reverse through a long stretch of track to the next loop. Whereas in Britain, lines were built to be as straight and level as possible, American lines were primarily built to follow contours, weaving around hills and obstructions, rarely building embankments, simply following the ground where it lay. By 1850, though the length of the network in America was 3 times higher than in Britain, the length of rail tunnel in Britain was 7 times higher. Of course, deep gullies were harder to bypass than hills. Engineers rapidly learned the art of building wooden trestle bridges, which would become a staple of 19th century American railways. Due to the varying quality of wood and the slightly imprecise nature of structural engineering at the time, these bridges had to be heavily over-engineered to give plenty of margin of error. Though secure, they could bounce and sway alarmingly as a train passed over them, but they fulfilled an important purpose in getting the network built quickly at a time when wood was the only building material available in such high quantities. The steeper gradients and wider routes demanded engines more suitable for this environment. Early American railways were primarily dependent on locomotives imported from Britain. But as industry grew in America, engine manufacturing took off, now tailored for the American network. In 1837, Henry R. Campbell of the Germantown and Norristown Railway designed the world's first 440 locomotive, which was constructed at the Baldwin Locomotive Works. The extra set of drive wheels allowed it to pull trains of 450 tons, 63% more than the best of Baldwin's 420 locomotives. However, Campbell's locomotive proved impractical. Its rigid frame and poor suspension made it prone to coming off the track. Manufacturers Garnett and Eastwick improved on these designs with their own engine known as Hercules. The lead wheels were placed on a separate truck, which pivoted independently, allowing it to handle tighter bends. To improve traction further, they employed 3-point suspension. The wheels were divided into 3 groups, with each held on a separate frame, designed so that any loss of grip on one wheel would transfer the weight to another. The 3 groups of wheels were attached to the main frame at a single point each, allowing it to sit on the 3 points of contact which make up a plane. 440 trains like Hercules did a great deal to improve the power and reliability of locomotives, capable of handling the gradients and bends of America's lines. These would soon become informally known as American Standard locomotives, a design which would dominate the network for the next few decades. Over the course of the 1840s, railways more than tripled in length. Looking at a map, it could appear as though a network was nicely shaping up, but the reality on the ground was far from it. And this largely stemmed from the way the railways were organised. Lines in Britain required an Act of Parliament to be built, meaning that there was a central authority overseeing everything right from the start, with the expectation that the scattered companies would ultimately link to form a cohesive network. American companies, on the other hand, were overseen by state governments, and each company saw themselves as a separate entity. Even where they met, there was little effort to connect their lines. Travelling any great distance would require a lot of time spent disembarking the train, walking to a station on the other side of town, and joining a new train. The lack of coordination was displayed in the gauges of the tracks. While some effort was made by the companies to match their gauge to the companies around them, a company in Georgia would have little reason to worry about what a company in Maine was doing. By 1850, there were at least 6 different gauges of tracks on the main line, creating an impenetrable break of gauge wherever they met. But this break was more than welcome to most. Where companies met, town planners would deliberately place their stations on either side of town. For the companies, this eliminated the supposed competition the other company would bring. For locals, the long gap between the stations would require travellers to spend time walking through town, hopefully spending some money along the way. For most, the idea of a national network was not wanted. Each state saw themselves as an independent entity. The railways they were commissioning were purely to cater to the state's need. Some states even passed legislation forbidding rail companies from crossing the border. Many preferred to see the railways as a short-distance route to cater to local needs. Bigger companies, facilitating long-distance transport, would make better profits skipping over the small towns, leaving them unable to take full advantage of the railway. But for big businesses, there was money to be made if larger routes could be built. And a project was shaping up that would change the outlook of rail planning. The Erie Railroad was envisioned as a means of linking New York with Lake Erie, eliminating the monopoly enjoyed by the Erie Canal. It was founded in 1832, but it would take almost 20 years to see fruit. It ran into a series of issues, both technical and financial. For instance, it was believed that the rough ground could best be crossed by building the line on piles. More than 100 miles, 160 kilometres of these wooden piles were driven into the ground before it was realised that the foundations were too unstable, and a more conventional track needed to be built alongside them. The strains on the company's finances proved immense, and they were forced to file for bankruptcy 5 times over the course of the construction. At one point, they were saved only by a successful appeal to the New York state government, who not only agreed to write off $3 million in loans they had acquired, but also to create an additional $3 million in loans to boost the project. The line was built to a 6-foot or 1.829 metre gauge, as it was believed that this would be superior for long-range transport. This allowed for larger engines, but produced a lot of compatibility and maintenance issues. At Taruka Creek, they built the Taruka Viaduct, at the time the largest rail viaduct in the world, 100 feet, 30 metres high, with 17 spans of 50 feet, 15 metres wide. The line finally opened in 1851. For a brief time, this was the longest railway in the world. The Erie Railroad greatly boosted trade across the state, cementing New York as the foremost port on the East Coast, and proving the value of long-distance rail travel. One other important innovation on the line was to show the full use of the telegraph system. Telegraph lines have been running alongside many American railways since the Baltimore and Ohio had installed them in 1843. They allowed rail companies to pass information rapidly over long distances, while the telegraph companies had a quick means of travelling the line to perform inspections and maintenance. But most rail crews viewed the telegraph as a novelty, preferring to rely on what they could see. When the Erie's chief superintendent Charles Minow had persuaded the company to install telegraph poles, they were initially viewed by many as unnecessary. But Minow could see the potential of the system, and was annoyed that crews were not taking full advantage. He would soon get a chance to prove his point. In 1851, he was seated in a westbound train from Turner's Station, but saw that there was a delay. The line was single-tracked, and the only passing loops were at the stations. Minow's train was due to wait for an eastbound train to pass them there, but there was no sign of it from the lookouts. Annoyed to find that no one was using the telegraph to find out more, Minow marched into the telegraph office and ordered them to contact the next station to see if the eastbound train had passed there yet. Finding that it hadn't, he ordered the next station to expect his train first, and to hold the eastbound train if it arrived there before them. He then ordered his own train on, but the driver refused, unwilling to trust his life to a newfangled technology. Minow took over the footplate himself, ordering the driver to ride upon the cushions. The driver took a seat in the rearmost carriage, fearing a head-on collision. But the train did not collide, and reached the next station to find that the eastbound train had still not arrived there. Minow telegraphed ahead once more, and found that the eastbound train had not reached the next station either, so he ordered his train on once more. In total, he did this 4 times in a row, before finally passing the train everyone had been insisting on waiting for at the first station. Minow's impatience made a public spectacle, which proved the value of the telegraph to the railways, allowing information to be transmitted long distance. Directors and signallers could know where every train was at any given time, giving them a much more strategic overview from which to make decisions. The success of the Erie Railroad led the way for many similar long-distance rail projects. These became known as big trunk routes, carrying the cross-country traffic, while the smaller branch lines handled local and feed-in traffic. It was all part of a track-building boom which tripled the length of the network over the course of the 1850s. The Pennsylvania Railroad was designed to connect the state's 2 biggest cities at Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. The route required them to build through the Allegheny Mountains, requiring some quite innovative inclines and tunnels, some of the first built in North America. At the same time, the Baltimore and Ohio finally reached the Ohio River it had been intended to access, boosting Baltimore's access to inland trade, but too late to stop New York's dominance. In New York State, the New York Central was formed in 1853 by merging 10 smaller companies, who were stitched together to form a single continuous route, rivaling the other trunk routes. The Illinois Central was completed in 1856, running from Cairo in the south to Galena and Chicago in the north, connecting the length and breadth of the state. Upon completion, it snatched the Erie's title of the longest railway in the world. The Mobile and Ohio Railroad was conceived as a means of allowing Mobile to access the Ohio River, allowing it to rival New Orleans in the lucrative north-south trade it enjoyed along the Mississippi. It was completed in April 1861, just in time for the Civil War to block its river access. Nonetheless, it will play a big role in the conflict. Some were even expanding into Canada. The US and Canada wished to connect their networks across the Niagara River, but to do so would require a 251 metre or 825 foot bridge across the Niagara Gorge. Many designs were submitted, prominent among which was a tubular design designed by Robert Stephenson, based on a successful Britannia Bridge. But the winning design was submitted by John Augustus Roebling, who wished to build a suspension bridge. Many believed that such an idea would not work, as suspension bridges tend to bounce and sway, while railways need to be largely rigid. A previous attempt on the Stockton and Darlington Railway had been alarmingly unstable every time a train went over, requiring it to be shut after a few years. But Roebling believed he could make it work. He backed his proposals up with tons of intricate calculations, and was thus able to convince people to invest in his scheme. Charles Elliott Jr. built a temporary bridge on the back of several cables he trailed across the gorge using kites. Using this as scaffolding, the bridge was constructed over the course of 4 years, suspended from 2 huge granite towers. The final bridge spanned the gorge in a single go, 250 feet 76 metres high. It had 2 decks, with trains running on the upper level and road traffic on the lower. Roebling was admired for his ergonomic design. His bridge used a sixth the material required to build Stephenson's Britannia Bridge, despite being twice as long, and it was estimated that Stephenson's designs for a tubular Niagara Bridge would have cost 10 times as much. The first line in California, the Arcata and Mad River Railroad, opened in 1854, followed by the longer Sacramento Valley Railroad a year later. With the opening of the latter, travel fares from San Francisco to San Jose fell from $32 by stagecoach to $2.50 by rail, with a trip taking the third of the time. Freight rates greatly dropped too, stimulating growth, with farmers, miners and loggers all benefiting from the line. Meanwhile, lines were extending west from the Mississippi, and calls were growing for a Transcontinental Railroad which would link the 2 halves of the country. A series of scouting expeditions were organised, plotting routes across the sparsely populated West. The government even orchestrated the Gadsden Purchase to acquire around 30,000 square miles or 77,000 square kilometres of land from Mexico, so as to give favourable ground for a southern route. But for the time being, plans were not getting off the drawing board, primarily due to political factors. The industrialised northern states and the slave-owning southern states each wished to spread their economic structures out west. Each wanted to be the one to whom the Transcontinental would connect. Fearing the other would use the line to hem them in, politicians on both sides worked to block any plan that would allow their rival to get the Transcontinental first. Of course, the South was lagging behind in rail building in general. Though there was a similar track building boom there in this era, it continued to be driven by small companies catering to local interests, rather than the long-distance rail movement of people and goods. By the time of the Civil War, the southern states could boast only half the length of track in the north, and no trunk routes running east-west. The population regarded the northern industry with fear and suspicion. Strong rail links could serve as highways for big businesses in the north to worm their way in, destroying their way of life and bringing dangerous ideas such as abolitionism. Their reluctance to embrace the railways would cost them in the war to come. That's not to say the North had a fully united network themselves. Companies, though larger, continued to build on their own island, with no American equivalent of the Railway Executive Committee to coordinate their efforts. There were a whole host of different track gauges in use, and much of their rolling stock was incompatible. Even where systems were compatible, companies were reluctant to allow their stock to travel on rival companies' lines. With no direct connection, passengers would have to transfer en masse where companies met, and freight would have to be transshipped, often to the other side of town, a process which could take days. But many were able to benefit of this arrangement. Interchange towns drew a roaring trade from the numbers of people and goods passing through from one station to another. When a stretch of track running from Erie, Pennsylvania to the New York border was re-gauged to allow for through running, the residents were so outraged that they formed a militia army and repeatedly wrecked the track, tearing up long stretches of it and destroying bridges. But one city would benefit from the haphazard way the network was built more than any other. Many of the rail projects in Illinois and beyond were conceived as a means of allowing strong connections to trade on Lake Michigan. The best way to do so was to link to the docks in Chicago. At the same time, the 4 main trunk routes were expanding west. Not wanting to encroach on the territory of the Western rail companies, they instead converged upon Chicago to link up with their main terminals. By the time of the Civil War, 11 different rail companies serviced Chicago. It was thus that Chicago would become America's main rail hub, forming the link between the eastern and western halves of the network. Though a few lines were built to facilitate the transfer of goods wagons, the people of Chicago were in no mood to lose their status as a major rail hub, and did little to encourage through lines to be built. The masses passing through the city every day were just too good a boon for local businesses. West of Chicago, lines were expanding, but faced a barrier in the Mississippi River. The many navigable rivers in North America were a common break in the early years of rail travel. Rail companies in this era typically favoured handling these obstacles with ferries, requiring passengers and goods to embark and disembark. In the winter, many of these rivers would freeze over, whereupon passengers would cross the ice on foot. But on occasions, temporary railways would be built directly onto the ice. It would of course be much simpler to cross via a bridge, but a number of issues stood in the way of building one. One was the practical issue of building such large structures. Ferries were typically much easier to set up in the short term. The Erie Railroad turned down an opportunity to buy the New York and Harlem Railroad, which would have brought it right to the heart of Manhattan, under the bizarre reasoning that passengers would enjoy the ferry ride down the Hudson more. There was the additional issue of pressure from the steamship companies. Publicly, they believed the bridges would serve as a hazard to navigation, but they were also unofficially keen to do what they could to limit their growing rival. While river traffic was still thriving, the rapid growth of the railways was encroaching on their business, especially now that railways were being built running in parallel to the main rivers. This dispute would soon come to a head. The Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific Railroad was opened from Chicago as far as Rock Island in 1854. A year later, they ran the first train in Iowa from Davenport to Council Bluffs. To link these up, they were building the government bridge across the Mississippi, using Rock Island as a stepping stone. The bridge was controversial, but not only because of objections from steamship companies, it also took on a political element. As Rock Island was the former site of Fort Armstrong, Secretary of Defense Jefferson Davis had a say in the bridge's construction. He initially supported the project, but changed his mind when it became clear that the bridge could serve as a jumping-off point for a Transcontinental Railroad which would favour the North. He called for the construction to be halted. He was backed by a number of prominent Southerners and by the city of St. Louis, the other site where the trunk lines met. They aimed to become the gateway to the West, but lacked a bridge of their own. They feared Chicago would take the title from them. But their objections fell on deaf ears, and the bridge was opened in 1856, 1,582 feet, 482 metres long, with 8 spans, including one rotating section to allow steamships through. Just 15 days later, a steamship called the Effie Afton collided with the bridge, causing a span to collapse on top of it. Worse still, the boat caught fire, setting light to part of the bridge in turn. This accident was most likely due to a stalled paddle wheel, but some historians have speculated on the possibility of sabotage. This was the first time the Effie Afton had been so far upriver, and opponents of the bridge organised celebrations suspiciously quickly. Of course, this is all just speculation. The steamship companies took things further by suing the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific, taking this incident as proof that the bridge was a hazard to navigation. It was built in a rapid flow area of the Mississippi, and its draw span was at an angle to the main current. Fortunately, the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific had a skilled lawyer defending them called Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln wisely ignored claims of conspiracy, instead working to illustrate that the accident was down to an error on the Effie Afton's part. He personally oversaw several surveys of the area, which showed that the river currents were tolerable. He then passionately argued that it would be necessary to enshrine the rights of the railways to bridge the rivers if they were to be used to facilitate the settlement of the West. The jury was split down the middle. As the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific was the defending party, this meant that by default the steamship companies didn't win. They appealed this case higher, finally reaching the Supreme Court in 1862. But by then, Lincoln was president, and plans for a Transcontinental Railroad were in full swing, with the repaired bridge playing a vital role. Their case was brought to an end. Despite the narrow win, this case served to permanently establish the rights of rail companies to bridge the rivers, and signalled a clear shift in government policy away from the waterways and towards the railways. Lincoln well understood the power of the railway. In his election campaign of 1860, he made heavy use of rail transport to move from city to city to get his message to a much wider audience. He won the election thanks to a narrow majority in the northern vote, and made his way to the White House with the aim of halting the expansion of slavery into the West. To many in the southern slave states, this was unacceptable. So unpopular was Lincoln there that 10 of the states hadn't even put him on the ballot. The slave states held rapid referendums, where 11 of them voted to secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States. When Fort Sumter refused to lower the Stars and Stripes, the Confederates fired on it, kicking off a civil war. A war that would show the world the full military potential of the railways. Contrary to what's often claimed, the American Civil War was not the first time railways were used in warfare. As early as the Mexican War, trains had been employed to transport troops some of the way to the front. Later, in the Crimean War, the British built the first purpose-built military railway between their main supply port of Balaclava and their siege lines at Sevastopol. But the Civil War was the first time that railways would play such a fundamental role in the conflict, with the railways forming the lifeblood of the war machines on both sides, and becoming a focal point of many campaigns. The importance of rail strategy was illustrated early on. In April 1861, President Lincoln called for a 75,000-strong force to defend Washington, which sat just inside Union territory, and only 100 miles, 160 kilometers, from the Confederate capital of Richmond. Naturally, this force was transported to Washington by rail. To get there, they had to change trains at Baltimore. But with no direct link between the stations, the troops would have to march across the city. The trouble was, though Maryland had voted against secession, Confederate sentiment was high in Baltimore. The presence of Union troops there started a riot, in which 5 soldiers and 12 civilians were killed. To avoid a repeat of this, Lincoln ordered the military to oversee the construction of a track to bypass Baltimore, allowing supplies and reinforcements to flow more smoothly into Washington. The troops assigned to the construction would become the forerunners to the United States Military Railroad Organization. In July, the main Union force moved south, hoping to knock out the main Confederate army before they could concentrate, and seize Richmond early on. But the Confederates were able to rapidly transfer 8,000 troops from the Shenandoah Valley by rail to meet the enemy at Manassas with almost even numbers and drive them back. Both sides now recognised the military potential of railways and rapidly began discussing how best to utilise them. For the North, they could act as avenues of invasion, transporting and resupplying their troops deep into Confederate territory. For the South, they could use their interior lines of communication to shift their limited reinforcements to meet each thrust the Union made. A lot depended on how each side could utilise this potential. In January 1862, Congress passed the Railways and Telegraph Act, granting the President sweeping powers over every railway in the country. In February, the United States Military Railroad Organization was formally created to oversee operations. Military traffic would take precedence over civilian traffic. If companies refused to cooperate, the USMRR's dedicated railroading units could seize the line and run it themselves. By the end of the war, the USMRR operated over 2,000 miles, 3,200 kilometers of track, utilizing 419 locomotives and 6,330 coaches and boxcars. To act as their executive commander in the field, the USMRR appointed Herman Haupt, a former West Point graduate with a strong career in rail engineering, the perfect credentials for the job at hand. Under his guidance, the USMRR would have to create the rules on military railways almost from scratch, and they did an admirable job. Haupt created dedicated engineering teams to facilitate the construction and maintenance of military railways, with repair teams ready to be rapidly deployed to fix damage done by the enemy. They got a chance to prove their worth early on. In May 1862, the Confederates withdrew from Northern Virginia, destroying the 400-foot, 120-metre Potomac Creek Bridge behind them. Haupt personally oversaw the reconstruction of the bridge out of locally sourced timber. Under his supervision, the line was up and running again in just 9 days. An unidentified observer commented that the Yankees could build bridges faster than the rebels could burn them. In time, they created prefabricated bridges, which could be transported by rail in sections and rapidly assembled with simple tools. At the same time, Haupt drew up procedures of how to handle the increased traffic on the network, creating a series of priority tiers. Essential supplies would come first, followed by ammunition, followed by medical equipment, followed by troop transports. Schedules would be organised by rail workers rather than by military people. This prevented self-important commanders prioritising their own units. When the trains reached their destination, instructions were drawn on how to create unloading yards where there were insufficient facilities available, together with the correct procedures for handling the goods. All boxcars were to be unloaded as soon as possible, reloaded as appropriate, and promptly sent back. This ensured a continuous conveyor belt of supply. This blocked a practice of some commanders who had been using boxcars as storehouses or barracks. Some accounts describe an incident where Haupt discovered a general who was using a boxcar as his personal headquarters. Haupt personally seized the man and threw him out on the tracks, tossing his papers out behind him. Under these procedures, Haupt reckoned that a single-track branch line could supply a camp of 200,000 men indefinitely. He got a chance to prove his point in 1863, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee invaded Pennsylvania. The Union armies marched to meet him at a town called Gettysburg. The nearest railhead was at Westminster, which sat at the end of a single-track branch line. Since it would be too hard to manage two-way traffic, Haupt grouped the trains into convoys of 5, which ran continuously back and forth along the line. This kept the army supplied for the 3 days of the battle, while Lee's army was decimated in reckless frontal assaults. The North's unified and carefully coordinated railways were studied across the world as examples of how to handle them in times of war. In contrast, the Confederate response left a lot to be desired. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had spent the pre-war years furiously campaigning against the idea of a central government telling the states what to do, which made things awkward when he was suddenly at the head of such a government. With the state's philosophy aligned against centralisation, coordinating a war economy was a very slow and haphazard process. The railways were no exception. Several attempts were made to create a Confederate equivalent of the Railways and Telegraph Act, but it did not pass the Confederate Congress until February 1865, by which time it was far too late to make any difference in the war. For most of the war, the military had to coordinate with each rail company individually, and though the companies publicly supported the Confederate cause, in reality they were much more concerned with their own business needs, and with no dedicated railroading units, the military had little power to force them into line. This caused a lot of issue throughout the war. For instance, in 1862, the Confederate government ordered operators in Georgia to send rolling stock north to aid the evacuation of equipment as their troops retreated from western Tennessee. But this was blocked by the governor of Georgia, who forbade them from straying far beyond the border, fearing that the state would lose valuable rolling stock this way. He went as far as threatening to use Georgia troops to fight any force sent to take the engines. Not wishing to kick off a civil war within a civil war, the government was forced to back down, and a lot of valuable equipment was lost in Tennessee. Even with proper planning, the Confederates would be at a disadvantage. The Confederate states operated barely a third of the nation's track, with very little network and no big trunk routes running east-west. What little network they had was steadily dismantled as the war went on. Worse still, the overwhelming bulk of the nation's industry was in the north. Upon secession, the South was left with few facilities to construct locomotives, rails and wagons. The government didn't help by prioritising factories that produced ordnance. Meanwhile, the spare rails that they had stockpiled were seized by the Confederate Navy, who wished to use the material to build ironclads. With few spare parts available, engines and rolling stock became increasingly worn as the war went on, and any track constructed or replaced required a piece of track to be dismantled elsewhere. A further problem was staff shortages. Before the war, a third of Southern rail workers were from the north, since locals often distrusted this technology. Many of them naturally deserted early on in the war. The Confederate government banned rail workers from enlisting in the army, but they still found themselves badly short of free workers and increasingly reliant on slaves. Naturally, the slaves were disinclined to aid in a war which was being fought against their freedom. Many spent much of the war making as little effort as they could get away with. Drivers could do little to force them due to fears of kicking off a slave revolt. Despite these issues, the Confederates did achieve some successes. New connections were built, bypassing breaks in the line to aid the rapid movement of vital supplies to the main battlefields. They also created repair teams who could patch up track and rolling stock just as well as their northern counterparts, as long as they had the supplies available. They even created their own prefabricated bridges, as there was no shortage of wood in the south. As well as transporting troops and supplies to the front, the railways were all too often employed in carrying the wounded the other way. Over the course of the war, both sides pioneered hospital trains to rapidly move the wounded out of the war zone, as well as providing them treatment on the move. Northern engineers stripped the seats out of carriages and installed special beds, running on a variety of suspension systems to ensure as smooth a ride as possible. But the rough rails they were running on still left them with a very wonky ride, and many an injured soldier was thrown out of bed. This was one of the main reasons that the most seriously injured soldiers were placed in the bottom bunk, so there would be less distance to fall. The resource-strapped Confederates simply had the wounded lie in piles of straw. This meant their trains could carry fewer people at once, but ironically allowed for a smoother ride, since the straw provided natural cushioning with none of the risk of falling out of bed. A less wholesome invention to come out of the war was rail batteries. Both sides built special flatbeds on which heavy guns could be mounted, ready to be rapidly deployed to any battle which was happening sufficiently close to a railway. Lighter armoured blockhouses were attached to many trains, providing some protection from raiders. This protection was a necessary feature. Due to the importance of the railways to the running of the war, both sides regularly raided each other's tracks to disrupt operations. They would burn bridges, boxcars and warehouses, they would deliberately crash locomotives, and they would lift track, build piers out of the sleepers and lay the rails on top, so as the piers burned, the rails would naturally droop. Those with more time could twist them around trees, making them harder to repair. Hermann Haupt created a system of pry bars which could twist a rail into a helix, requiring it to be sent to a mill for re-rolling. On many occasions, a well-timed and executed raid was able to completely disrupt an entire campaign. Some of these raids could be quite spectacular. In April 1862, Union spy James Andrews devised a plan to knock out the Western Atlantic Railroad. He smuggled some troops through the lines, and together they stole an engine called the General from near Atlanta, and they raced north, with the intention of burning each bridge they passed over. Unfortunately, they hadn't counted on the tenacity of the General's conductor, William Fuller, who pursued them in a series of vehicles, overcoming every attempt to shake him off. The pursuers were able to stay right on their tail for 100 miles, preventing them from conducting any sabotage. A more successful raid was launched by Confederate General John Morgan in December 1862. With 4,000 cavalry, they attacked a chunk of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, the main artery supplying Union troops in Tennessee. Over the course of a week, they ran riot over the line, using captured telegraph stations to keep track of the enemy. They did so much damage that even Haupt's engineers took 6 months to repair everything. On the Union side, their biggest raiding success came in the spring of 1863, when Colonel Benjamin Grierson led a long sweep through Mississippi, wrecking every rail link along the way, and only losing 12 troops in the process. Not only did this throw the Confederate forces on the Mississippi into disarray, it provided a distraction while General Ulysses S. Grant encircled the key city of Vicksburg. The autumn of 1863 saw the war's biggest troop movements. Following the capture of Chattanooga by Union forces, the Confederates in the area called for reinforcements from the east. 12,000 troops were dispatched from Virginia for this purpose. With Chattanooga having fallen, the most direct route was blocked off. Instead, they were forced to take a winding route along the coast, through the Carolinas and up through Georgia. This journey required 14 transfers and 900 miles, 1,400 kilometers of travel along worn and battered rails. Nonetheless, the Confederates pulled it off. They arrived in time to meet the Union troops at Chickamauga, achieving a rare numerical superiority and winning a surprise victory. The Confederates proceeded to besiege Chattanooga. The Union forces came under the authority of Ulysses S. Grant. Grant reckoned they would need thousands of reinforcements within 15 days to break the siege, and the railway stepped up to the plate. 25,000 troops were transferred from the east, with a journey of 1,200 miles or 3,000 kilometers, requiring 8 transfers. Not only the troops, but all their equipment and supplies, with resupply stations set up every 50 miles, 80 kilometers. They arrived in just 11 days, and rapidly broke the siege. It has been described as the biggest, fastest mass movement of troops before the 20th century. The next year, Union General William T. Sherman pushed south into Georgia with the aim of capturing Atlanta. The Confederates wrecked the rail lines before him, but by now, the repair teams were operating like a well-oiled machine, and stopping to rebuild the tracks barely slowed Sherman down. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman pushed south towards the coast, determining to carve a trail of destruction as he went. Any railway or supply base that was of no use to the Union was razed to the ground. Sleepers, bridges and boxcars were burnt, and engines had holes blasted through their smokestack. It was said that they wrapped a rail around every tree between Atlanta and Savannah, earning the feature the nickname of Sherman's neckties. This destruction served little practical purpose, but it served to demoralise the South, and left their network in utter disarray at the war's close. At the same time, Grant was renewing the drive towards Richmond. Unable to break the Confederate defences, he instead focused his campaign on the rail line supplying the capital. The capture of the Southside Railroad in April 1865 triggered a collapse, and forced Robert E. Lee to flee the city in disarray. A week later, he surrendered at Appomattox, effectively ending the war. It has been argued that without the railways, the war could not have been won. While the North had many advantages in numbers and materials, the South had a key advantage in that they didn't actually have to win the war. They just had to keep fighting long enough to convince the North that the war wasn't worth it. And in any previous conflict, it would have been a logistical nightmare to capture, occupy and pacify an area the size of Western Europe. Had the states seceded just 10 years earlier, it is likely the war would have taken twice as long. But with the railways now covering a much greater area of the country, it greatly sped up the rate at which troops could mobilise, redeploy and resupply. Campaigns which would have taken weeks now took days. This allowed the Union to drive right into the Confederate heartlands. The Confederates too made use of this new technology, but poor decisions and resource starvation prevented them from using it to its fullest extent. Of course, the railways also unleashed a new form of industrialised warfare on a world which had never seen the like. Engagements large enough for historians to dub them battles happened on average every 4 days in the Civil War, compared to every 10 days in the Revolution. Both sides were able to keep feeding troops into the slaughter faster than ever before. It was one of the many factors which contributed to make the American Civil War as bloody as all of America's wars combined. The Southern railways were devastated by the conflict, but the North's saw a great boost. Before the war, trade routes had typically run north-south, in parallel with the main rivers. But with the Confederates initially occupying the lower sections of these rivers, communications shifted to east-west, with the big trunk railways taking on this additional traffic. With the bulk of the fighting happening in the south, they were free to thrive off this new traffic. In the northern states, 600 miles, 960 kilometres of new track were built over the course of the war. But the biggest rail project of all was happening out west. And that, a quick glance at the map in 1861 would show the United States were far from united. They were split north-south by slavery and east-west by the Great Plains. The main overland travel links connecting the eastern and western states were slow, lumbering wagon trains, which took around 6 months. The only alternatives were a long voyage around Cape Horn, or a shorter voyage to Panama with an overland trek through the mosquito-infested rainforest. The latter was made easier in 1855 by the construction of the Panama Railway, the first direct rail link between the Atlantic and the Pacific. But this was still far from ideal, and calls were growing for a rail connection within the US borders. Many such schemes had been proposed as far back as the 1810s, but each had run into practical issues. To connect the coasts, the railway would have to cross 2,000 miles or 3,200 kilometres of wilderness, through plains, deserts, rivers and mountains. It would be a project unlike anything the world had seen before. Nonetheless, visionaries believed it could be done. A series of surveys were conducted across the gap, but the one that would make history was conducted by a man called Theodore Judah, who spent the greater part of the 1850s surveying the Sierra Nevada mountains, collecting as much information as possible, before travelling to Washington in 1861 to present his 13,000-word report to Congress. Some of Judah's early proposals had run into political roadblocks due to Southern politicians who wished for a transcontinental to connect to them first. But thanks to the Civil War, these people were not showing up for work, and there was nothing then to stop President Lincoln from bringing the proposal forward. In July 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act was signed into law. Two companies were formed to run the line. The Union Pacific would build west from Omaha, while the Central Pacific would build east from Sacramento. The two would meet in the middle, though where was not initially set. The idea was that construction would be sped if the two were to race to cover as much ground as possible. To provide them a financial incentive, the companies would receive 10 square miles of land for every mile of line built, along with $16,000 per mile in government bonds. The money would be doubled in the more difficult terrain of the Nebraska prairies and the Sacramento Valley, and tripled in the mountains. The race was on. Judah returned to California, bringing with him shiploads of equipment to get the line started, industry being largely non-existent on the west coast at the time. There he met with a consortium of 4 shopkeepers, who formed the core of the Central Pacific. Judah had convinced them to buy into his scheme, as it would give them access to the newly discovered silver mines in the Nevada territory. All of them played their part in the company, but one of the 4, Charles Crocker, would manage the construction. He created his own firm, Charles Crocker & Company, who would oversee the initial construction, whilst buying its materials from companies in which the shopkeepers held majority shares. The companies were instructed to jack up their prices so the maximum amount of government investment would go into the shopkeepers' pockets at the expense of the Central Pacific. These backroom dealings did not sit right with the more idealistic Judah, nor did he take kindly to a request to adjust his survey to make it look like the mountains were further west than they were, which would mean the Central Pacific could collect the larger grants afforded to them in the mountains sooner. With friction growing between them, the shopkeepers bought Judah out of his own project. He headed east, hoping to find new investors, but caught yellow fever as he crossed Panama and died shortly afterwards. With Judah gone, the shopkeepers could proceed as they pleased. Unfortunately, the first stage would be the hardest, a long climb into the Sierra Nevada mountains, up to a summit 7,000 feet or 2,100 meters above Sacramento. They were slowed further by labour shortages. The work was dangerous and exhausting, and the mines paid better, drawing workers that way. At the same time, the lack of industry in California meant that all their materials would have to be transported from the east by sea, rocked by storms and Confederate raiders. Construction proceeded at a snail's pace. Back in the east, the Union Pacific was forming, but the close proximity of the war meant that vital resources were being drawn away from the project, and so they could not yet get building. They held a pointless groundbreaking ceremony in December 1863 to secure their contract, before going home. Though not named in the Pacific Railroad Act, a businessman called Dr. Thomas Durant was able to weasel his way to the vice president status, with his friend John Dix as president, though Dix was little more than a figurehead. While he waited for the war to end, Durant founded the Credit Mobilier to handle construction, in which he was the primary shareholder, essentially allowing him to negotiate contracts with himself and up the prices Credit Mobilier charged at the expense of the Union Pacific. Like the shopkeepers, he and his inner circle would pocket as much of the government's investment as possible. But he did a worse job covering his tracks, and his scheme would come to light in the end. But this wouldn't happen until after the line was complete. Having founded the Credit Mobilier, Durant took $437,000 of Union Pacific funding and went to Washington to bribe as many people as possible, whilst persuading senior politicians and businessmen to buy into his scheme. His bribe persuaded Congress to double the size of the land grants awarded per mile. Across a 2,000-mile route, this would amount to a sum of land the size of Iceland. But the majority of this land would go to whoever built the most, and the Central were currently unable to capitalise on their head start due to being stuck in the mountains. But they had at least found a solution to their labour shortage. A wave of Chinese migrants were arriving on the west coast, fleeing the Taiping Rebellion. Crocker believed they could make a useful workforce, and hired 50 of them as a trial. The superintendent overseeing construction, James Harvey Stowbridge, was not happy about this. He said he wanted heavy beef-eating Irish labourers, not what he termed tiny rice-eaters. Crocker reminded him that the Chinese had built the Great Wall, so they must know something about large construction projects. The Chinese soon proved their worth, able to work longer, harder, and for half the pay of their Caucasian counterparts. Soon, thousands more were hired by the Central, with recruiters even sent to China to bring more people over. At its peak, the Central were employing 17,000 Chinese labourers, 90% of their workforce. For their efforts, the Chinese were treated horribly, both by their employers and by their peers. The Central were determined to break through the mountains before the Union could claim all of the route, and they drove the workers hard. With little time for health and safety, fatal accidents became an all too common occurrence. The worst culprit were the explosives used to blast apart the rock, which proved to be quite unstable. The workers were further decimated by a smallpox epidemic which spread through the camps. Their bodies were transported to China for burial. 1865 saw the end of the war. This left a large number of veterans at a loose end. The Union Pacific were able to recruit them as labourers, and with the war no longer drawing resources, construction could at last get underway. With their military discipline, the building teams soon picked up a strong rhythm, advancing westward across the flat grounds of the Great Plains. The best teams could reportedly lay a section of track in the space of just 30 seconds. The line was built to follow the contours of the land most of the way. This reduced time levelling the ground, and the longer route meant they would get more land grants. This also allowed Durant to create extra detours closer to land that he personally owned, driving up its value. This would all require future generations to spend a lot of time and money straightening the route, but that wasn't their problem. By October 1866, the Union had already reached the 100th parallel, 250 miles or 400 kilometres from the start. At the same time, the Central were reaching Cisco, just 80 miles or 130 kilometres from their start. However, up in the mountains, they were beginning to build up a rhythm. The teams blasted ledges into the sides of the mountains for the tracks to run on. They built huge wooden trestle bridges to cover the greater ravines, some of the largest wooden structures ever built. Where the mountain ranges proved too big, they dug tunnels through them by hand. As they moved further into the mountains, snow increasingly became a problem. Many of the towns founded along the route are now ski resorts. Avalanches also became a hazard. To protect the line, avalanche breakers were built along the way, while snow sheds were built along the more heavily affected sections. Long wooden structures with sloping roofs, designed to allow snow to slide harmlessly off. To keep their workforce fed, teams of sleigh drivers transported the food up into the mountains daily. Despite all their efforts, by the winter of 1867, the snow had become too thick for work to continue. Rather than stop, the Central Pacific decided to use the winter to complete a series of 6 tunnels through the mountains, reasoning that they would provide natural shelter. It was rough work, with labourers forced to both live and work in the tunnels or in snow shelters dug into the mountain. It was noisy, dusty, and poorly ventilated. At this stage, the Chinese labourers finally decided they had had enough. Thousands of them downed tools and went on strike. Stowbridge, who could see the workers' conditions firsthand, sympathised with them and urged a diplomatic approach. However, Crocker decided to take a forceful approach. He cut off the labourers' food supplies. With little means of simply quitting, they were starved into submission and forced to return to work, though conditions did reportedly improve slowly. With no mountain to slow them down, the Union Pacific were speeding across Nebraska. Behind them, farms and settlements sprang up in a patchwork on either side of the line. The government encouraged settlers to move to the area by passing a series of homestead acts which granted land to those who applied on the condition that they could be shown to improve it. The problem was, it wasn't the government's land to give away. The 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie had recognised the vast Cheyenne and Arapaho territory between the Rocky Mountains and Kansas. The natives would stop attacks on settlers moving through, provided they stuck to prescribed routes, which they frequently strayed from. And the government would provide an annual tribute of food and weapons, which they frequently failed to do. Building a railway through their territory was a final clear violation of the treaty. Not only would it directly steal their land, it would form a barrier through the middle. Perhaps worse still, it would cut off the migratory routes of the bison the tribes fed on. Naturally, the natives were not consulted in advance, with any discussion of them treating them purely as an obstacle to be overcome. The Central Pacific, for its part, tried to approach the natives diplomatically. To avoid trouble, they discussed the routes with the tribes to minimise disruption. They made the railway's presence attractive to them by offering free boxcar travel to the natives, while the tribal chiefs could travel for free in the carriages. They even hired a good number of natives in the construction of all genders. They noted with some surprise that the native women could handle sledgehammers and crowbars better than most of the men. The Union Pacific, on the other hand, took a brute force approach. With their workforce mostly made up of combat veterans, they armed as many of them as they could, with instructions to shoot any native who should interfere with the construction. They had essentially elected to fight their way across the Great Plains, and the natives would respond in kind. While the tribal chiefs believed they could resolve the situation diplomatically, younger groups believed diplomacy had already failed, and they had no choice but to attack. The 1860s saw a series of raids upon rail storehouses and working parties. However, most of these were directed against the neighbouring Kansas Pacific Railroad, which ran much deeper into the Sioux, Cheyenne and Arapaho heartlands. But it was the Union Pacific where they would pull off their greatest hit. One night in August 1867, a team of 5 workers were travelling the line near Plum Creek by handcar, trying to find a break in the telegraph line. They were ambushed by a party of Cheyenne. The Cheyenne killed all but one man, who survived by playing dead, even as the Cheyenne scalped him. He staggered home the next day carrying his scalp. The Cheyenne pulled up a section of track and derailed a freight train as it sped along the line, the only confirmed instance of Native Americans derailing a train. The driver and fireman were killed on impact, while the rest of the crew fled into the darkness. They flagged down another train and reversed at full speed. The Cheyenne then spent the night looting the train, delighted to find large quantities of the goods they had been promised in tribute but infrequently delivered. As the sun came up, they set light to what was left and withdrew. But this triumph was short-lived, as these attacks gave the US Army just the excuse they needed to turn their full force against the natives. General William Tecumseh Sherman had been infamous for his scorched earth policies during the war. Now he applied the same policy against the Native Americans. An exclusion zone was created around the lands the Union Pacific were due to be granted, and the army swept ahead of construction. Any native who refused to leave was shot, man, woman or child. Settlements were burnt, and herds of bison were wiped out to cut off their food supplies. The American public knew this was happening and celebrated. The papers printed triumphant cartoons depicting the natives as primitive savages fleeing as the railways carried civilization forward. For many, the railways meant they could now abandon all pretense about respecting native sovereignty. As the network grew in the West, the natives would find themselves increasingly hemmed in. Arming the Union Pacific workers had a dangerous knock-on effect, as they were a greater threat to each other than the natives were. As the line advanced, the workers roaming shantytown followed it along, which took on the name Hell on Wheels. Saloons, brothels and gambling dens accompanied them, hoping to make money off workers with little better to do in their time off. All of these things could easily lead their customers to ruin, and the concentration of desperate people and firearms meant that violence became commonplace. 3 times as many died in shootouts as died in accidents. With little civil law to rely on, the company turned to martial law to restore order, and the crackdowns could be quite brutal. At the town of Julesburg, gamblers had set up on land owned by the company. 200 armed sentries marched in and ordered them to leave. When they refused, the sentries began firing indiscriminately. Julesburg existed for only 5 months, but left behind 127 graves. To the west, the Central Pacific finally broke through the mountains in the summer of 1868. They now sped west through Nevada, laying track as fast as the Union Pacific had been able to in the plains. They were able to regain some ground on the Union, who had now reached the Rocky Mountains. However, as they climbed up into the Rockies, they were able to apply a lot of the lessons the Central had learned in the Sierras by trial and error. This sped up construction, and within only a few months, they had completed the tunnel at Sherman's Summit, the highest point on the line. By the start of 1869, both companies were rapidly approaching the Utah Territory. This was the main stomping ground of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. The Union decided that the LDS would be well suited for plotting a route through the territory for them. Unbeknownst to them, the Central had made a similar deal with the LDS at the same time. Since there was no coordination between the two, the LDS planned a separate route for both companies, running in parallel with each other most of the way, and the companies then began building on these routes. In the end, their lines overlapped by 222 miles, or 362 kilometres. Congress stepped in, and finally set a meeting point. They selected Promontory Point, just north of the Great Salt Lake. This set off a final race to see who could get there first. Crocker had a bet with Durant that they could lay the final 10 miles or 16 kilometres in a single day, which Durant agreed to. The Central Pacific set to the task, prepping truckloads of materials in advance. As each truck emptied, it was lifted off the track and the next one pushed into place. It was reported that they were laying track as fast as a man could walk. In this way, they covered the 10 miles in a single day and reached Promontory Point first. Before long, the Union Pacific joined them, with only a single section of track now separating the two. But the linking ceremony was delayed by 2 days. Durant reported that this was because rain had washed away a part of the Union Pacific's route, but there are records from the time telling a more interesting story. En route to the ceremony, Durant's train passed through Piedmont. Here, a group of several hundred workers, whose wages hadn't been paid in some time, stormed onto the tracks. They detached Durant's private car, shoved it into a siding, and chained the wheels to the rails, demanding a ransom for his release. Durant appealed for rescue, but a powerful local governor was also owed money by him for a grading contract and had no interest in helping him. Eventually, Durant wired to New York for the money, amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars. With Durant released, the ceremony could now get underway. Each company brought an engine to the end of the line. The final stretch was then laid by a team with members from both companies. Durant drove in the final golden spike, though he missed the sledgehammer several times first. With the line now complete, the two companies posed for one of the most famous photographs in American history. No one is sure how many died in the construction, but estimates run as high as 2,000 dead, with the Chinese labourers making up over half of the casualties. But despite all the exploitation, corruption and violence that had got the line built, it was a legitimately great engineering achievement. The length and scale of the line dwarfed anything that had been built before it. It rewrote many of the rules on rail construction, and for better or for worse, it changed the face of the American West. For the first time, it was possible to travel coast to coast by rail. This would fundamentally change the country's outlook towards rail travel, away from local hops towards long-distance transit. Across the country, smaller companies were merging to consolidate their resources, and to bring a more strategic plan to a wider area. In towns and cities, where travellers were once required to disembark and walk from one end to the other to change trains, rail companies and city planners began to work together to create a single central station. The Master Car Builders Association was formed in 1867, which worked to create a number of standards in the construction of rolling stock. Standard sets of parts across the board made maintenance and repair a lot simpler, whilst introducing features like standard coupling types meant that any train car was potentially compatible with any company in the country, meaning they could be transferred seamlessly from one company to another without their contents needing to be transshipped. Longer journeys also required a rethinking of passenger accommodation. A journey coast to coast could take over a week. Early journeys had incorporated a number of food and rest stops to allow passengers to eat and sleep. But not only were these inconvenient for the passengers, they also lost several hours travel time a day. It would save a lot of trouble if passengers could handle these things on the go. Sleeping cars had been introduced as far back as the 1830s, employing boards which could be placed across seats or folded down from above. But these were just bare boards, with passengers expected to supply their own sheets. As journeys got longer, builders increasingly looked into ways of making the experience more comfortable, but none would become more synonymous with luxury travel than those introduced by George Pullman. Whilst he didn't invent the sleeping car, he refined the concept and popularised luxury train travel, aiming to make the journey feel more like a hotel stay than a simple means of transport. The Pullman cars were equipped with central heating and ventilation and proper toilets to make the journey more comfortable. His aim was to make passengers almost forget that they were on a train, decking the carriages out with carpeting, draperies and upholstered chairs. Flexible covers were installed on the gaps between carriages, allowing passengers to move throughout the train without having to go outside. This allowed them access to libraries, card tables and of course restaurants. Here they would find the best quality food that could be made on a train. Each car came with seats which could be folded to create beds, with additional bunks which could be pulled down from above. Each bunk came equipped with comfortable sheets and privacy curtains. To cater to passengers' needs, Pullman hired a number of porters, who were trained to maintain the highest standards. He hired exclusively black people for this role, but this was far from an altruistic gesture. Pullman believed that black people were biologically predisposed to serve white people, and the more lax labour laws meant he could save on wages. At first, he didn't pay them at all and forced them to rely on tips. When the government intervened, he began paying them a pittance, with tips still making up the bulk of their earnings. Worse still, they had to pay for their own uniforms, as well as anything that got damaged in the journey, whether or not it was their fault. Porters were expected to wait on passengers hand and foot, adhering to the strictest standards of service, and to be available any time they were needed, which often meant staying awake for days on end. And for their service, they were subject to regular verbal and even physical abuse. Passengers would refuse to use their names, addressing them as Boy or George. Despite this, these positions were deeply sought after, as they were one of the few forms of stable employment available to black people at the time. They found ways to deal with obnoxious passengers, and if they found the right passengers, the tips could be quite generous, allowing many of them to buy their way into the middle classes. The Pullman cars were only available to those willing to pay a premium. Though there was no formalised class system on the railways, different services carried varying costs. At the other end of the scale from the Pullman cars were immigrant trains. These carried only the most Spartan of accommodations, bare wooden seats, a single stove for heating, and a hole in the floor for defecating, and whatever food they could snatch on the occasional rest stops. They were pulled by the slower locomotives, and regularly directed into sidings for days on end to allow more important traffic through, meaning that journeys could take days longer than advertised. And while the Pullman cars could be transferred from one company to another without the passengers needing to disembark, no such luxury was afforded to the immigrants, who would have to change several times as there has never been a single service running coast to coast. It was said that a pig could cross the country without changing trains, but an immigrant couldn't. Some businesses lived on the railways. In 1869, Dan Costello's Circus and Menagerie toured the new Transcontinental Railroad, putting on a show at every stop. This popularised the idea of the circus train, allowing these travelling shows to tour a much wider area than they could have managed by road. Circus trains were truly monster moves, hauling not only their performers, along with facilities for them to sleep and eat, but also boxcars containing all their equipment, tents and wagons, along with special containers for the animals that were all too common in circuses at the time. The arrival of a circus train in town was always a source for excitement. These trains saw a decline in the 20th century as the circuses began to shut down or move to the road, but the last circus train in the US was running as late as 2017. Longer trains, running longer distances, demanded more powerful engines than had been needed before. Engineers increasingly began to take advantage of the larger loading gauge on American railways, which allowed them to build bigger and more powerful engines all the time. And as coal became more available, it became the fuel of choice, much more powerful than the old wood-burning engines. But even the larger 440 American standards were beginning to look inadequate, and were being increasingly relegated to lighter passenger work, with companies becoming increasingly reliant on the 260 mogul class and 280 consolidation class. The extra drive wheels were a great boost to the available traction. While services advanced in quality, the network continued to grow. By 1880, every mainland state and territory could boast a rail connection. The Hoosac Tunnel opened in Massachusetts in 1875, giving several shared companies a more direct link between Boston and New York State. At the time of completion, this 4.75 mile or 7.64 kilometre tunnel was the longest in North America, and the second longest in the world. Construction had started in 1851, but suffered decades worth of delays, practical, financial and legal. To get the tunnel built, constructors made use of some of the first pneumatic drills and nitroglycerine charges. At least 135 workers died in the construction, the worst accident happening in 1867, when a leaking gasometer lamp in the central shaft was ignited by a candle. The resulting explosion knocked out the pumps, the ventilation and the workers' lift, trapping 13 people 165 metres or 541 feet below ground as the tunnel flooded. They were able to rig up a crude raft, but suffocated to death long before rescue could arrive. Other tunnels were closer to home. The construction of the Metropolitan Railway in London got people considering the possibility of similar underground railways in US cities. In 1870, Alfred L. E. Beach opened the Beach Pneumatic Railway in New York. Unable to run steam trains underground, he got creative. The carriage was built more like a capsule, which almost filled the tunnel, with passengers boarding from the ends. This allowed compressed air to be injected into the tunnel behind it, driving it along. Beach built a 300-foot or 90-metre tunnel in New York as proof of concept, which 400,000 passengers rode back and forth in its year of operation. But he was unable to convince investors about the viability of his idea, and the tunnel was soon shut down. More successful was the New York Overhead Railway, which opened between West Side and Yonkers in 1868, but soon expanded to cover the whole city. The New York subway would ultimately supersede it, but services continued running as late as 1958. Some of the biggest building projects were happening in the South, where the network had been devastated by the war and was being rebuilt almost from scratch. This attracted an influx of bankers and business people from the North, hoping to buy up lines on the cheap, patch them up, and sell at a profit. They took on the name of carpetbaggers. To get the lines built cheaply, they turned to the cheapest source of labour they could, slave labour. Although the 13th Amendment had outlawed the practice, it made an exception for convict labour, and this was a loophole the former slave owners exploited to its fullest extent. Black people will be caught in petty crimes, given years-long sentences of hard labour, and then assigned to the railways, the mines, or even the plantations. For all too many, this was a slow death sentence. Ironically, conditions were now worse than they had been when slavery was legal, as there was no need to compensate the slave owners if one was lost. Despite the money saved through forced labour, rebuilding or even extending the South's network soon proved to be far from the financial opportunity it had promised to be. While railways are the most efficient means of moving large amounts of people and goods, and a great boost to the local economy, they are very hard to run for profit. The carpetbaggers typically burnt through their initial investment and were driven into debt, long before they could get any return. While the carpetbaggers' enterprises may have failed, some of the larger companies were growing beyond anything the world had seen before, becoming the biggest private enterprises in the world at the time. This gave rise to a new breed of businessman known as the robber baron, a person fully prepared to employ unscrupulous methods to draw money to themselves, while screwing over their rivals, their workers, and even their own investors in the process. The construction of the Transcontinental had illustrated how it was possible for a business owner to exploit the poorly regulated markets this way. Thomas Durant created the Credit Mobilier to handle the Union Pacific construction, while secretly running both companies. Since he was doing deals with himself, he increased the Credit Mobilier's quotes, and paid for them in Union Pacific stock, and he exploited some loopholes to sell the stock at a reduced rate, allowing the Credit Mobilier, and therefore Thomas Durant, to claim even more. As the line advanced, the stock became more valuable, and he sold it for a great profit. This broke regulations for a competitive market, but he could get away with it, as he had much of the government in his back pocket. Others soon began plotting similar stock manipulation schemes. Daniel Drew got things going in 1866. The Erie Railroad was short of money. Drew made them a loan of $3.5 million, taking as security a big stack of shares and bonds which could be converted to stock. The investment provided a boost to the Erie and allowed its market value to rise, whereupon Drew began selling off bundles of shares. As the market value began to fall, he converted his bonds to shares, flooding the market and causing the value to plummet and bankrupting many of the Erie's directors, but allowing Drew to take over the company whilst making a $3 million profit for himself. In another of his schemes, he began short-selling stock on the New York and Harlem Railroad, but this caught the attention of his main rival, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who bought all these shares on the cheap, and soon manoeuvred himself into the presidency of the New York and Harlem. It was a small company, but it held a key strategic position, as the only railway to run directly into Manhattan. The much larger New York Central had running rights to use the line in the winter, but upon taking it over, Vanderbilt cancelled these rights, causing the New York Central's value to plummet, and allowing Vanderbilt to buy the whole company on the cheap. Soon afterwards, he also added the Hudson River Railroad to his growing empire. Feeling that this empire demanded a grand terminus in the city, he commissioned Grand Central Depot on 42nd Street, aiming to make it feel like the gateway to the country's interior, with ornate carvings and gaslit chandeliers. To keep out the soot of the locomotives, they would be disconnected a fair distance from the station in a flying switch, and the carriages rolled in under momentum. But Vanderbilt was after a monopoly on rail connections to New York, and that would mean buying the Erie Railroad as well. Drew's stock manipulation tactics gave plenty of opportunities for Vanderbilt to snatch it up. By 1867, he had accumulated enough Erie stock to earn a seat on the board. Determined to keep him from taking over, Drew teamed up with fellow directors Jay Gould and James Fisk. Together, they exploited some legal loopholes to print stock papers en masse. This severely diluted the value for their shareholders, but it ensured that they would maintain the majority share. Vanderbilt commented that he could buy the Erie but not their printing press. But the legal grey area did allow him to employ his wealth and influence in the city to order their arrest. But the three of them simply fled across the Hudson to New Jersey, taking the company's offices with them, away from Vanderbilt's influence. The two sides then spent a lot of time and expense bribing as many officials as possible, ultimately resulting in stalemate. Gould and Fisk soon dumped Drew from their partnership and began running the Erie themselves, continuing to use stock manipulation to amass regular bonuses for themselves, even as the Erie was hovering around bankruptcy each year. This was far from a unique situation. While the robber barons were raking it in, the railways they were running were operating at a loss most of the time. They were becoming increasingly dependent on speculative investment to stay afloat. Since new railways were better at attracting investors, they focused on building railways to nowhere, rather than improving existing lines, which could have allowed them to turn over a profit in themselves. The net result was a collection of companies which had to expand in order to survive. This was doomed to failure as there was a finite amount of capital available, and because the services were operating at a loss, those who had invested in them weren't getting a lot of returns, which got people increasingly questioning why they were investing at all. In 1872, the New York Sun was able to expose the Credit Mobilier scheme. Few involved suffered any direct consequences, but it had the effect of shaking people's confidence further. In 1873, the under-construction Northern Pacific Railway had taken out $1.5 million in loans from J. Cook & Company. They found themselves unable to sell their bonds to cover the debt, and soon had to file for bankruptcy. This had a cascade effect on the markets, with banks and rail companies going under in rapid succession. The New York Stock Exchange was forced to shut down for 10 days. This was the start of one of the longest recessions in American history. Within a year of the Northern Pacific, 115 rail companies had gone bankrupt, and the rate of track construction had dropped to less than a fifth of what it had been a year before. Their status as common carriers meant that rail companies couldn't reduce services to cut costs. Instead, they turned to one of the few factors they had control over: worker wages. How much wage reduction the rail workers saw varied from company to company, but typically hovered around the 30% mark. Workers on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had it worst. They saw their pay cut in half. This barely made a dent in company finances, but it was better than doing nothing. In the midst of their descent, railroad workers' unions began to become more active. The first union, known as the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, was formed in Michigan in 1863, followed by a number of similar organisations across the country. Early on, they were more like social clubs, a means of allowing workers to share their experiences and offer mutual support. Now they began to become more organised, with the idea spreading that workers could form together to protest these cuts. In 1877, the B&O announced another 10% pay cut, leading to workers in Martinsburg, West Virginia, to walk off the job, announcing that the freight would not move until pay was restored. The standard response to strikes was to fire and blacklist the strikers, but this had the unfortunate effect of leaving the unemployed workers with nothing to lose. Mobs of strikers began blocking the lines, ensuring no freight trains could pass, though they allowed passenger and mail services to pass in order to make it clear that their grievance was with the companies, who made most of their revenue from freight. When the police proved unable to quell the situation, the state governor called for militia to clear a way for the trains, with permission to use deadly force. The presence of armed militia inflamed the strikers, and the protest grew into a full riot, with casualties on both sides and company buildings burnt down. Momentum grew, with similar insurrections breaking out across the country, joined by workers from multiple companies and even other industries who were similarly disgruntled with their treatment. The worst violence was in Pittsburgh, where rioters tore 39 buildings, wrecked 104 engines, and destroyed at least 1,200 pieces of rolling stock. But the sporadic and disorganised nature of these riots doomed them to failure. Federal troops were called up and went from city to city putting down riots. When the dust settled, around 100 people had been killed and 1,000 arrested. Meanwhile, millions of dollars have been caused in damages and in lost revenue, since half the freight in the country had been brought to a standstill for several days. Even calling in the army to restore order ultimately cost the companies money. It was said that reducing wages had been as expensive as raising them. The strike had no direct effect, but the events hung over the heads of company directors for years to come, creating fears of another such strike. Within a few years, full pay had been restored. The unions could now see the power the workers had if they could threaten to withdraw their labour this way. They began to consolidate and swell their membership in the hope they could be better organised in the future. Though the companies did their best to emphasise and even exaggerate the violence and destruction caused by the rioters in the media, it was not hard for a public struggling under a recession that the robber barons had helped cause to sympathise with the rail workers' position. The rail companies were beginning to experience resentment from the working classes, who saw them as the very symbol of corporate greed and exploitation. This strained relationship will continue to define the next few decades of rail history, even as the financial situation improved for both sides. The growth of the American rail network had stalled following the financial crash of 1873, but by the 1880s the market had recovered, and track building resumed at a greater rate than ever before. Easily the biggest projects were happening in the West. Between the Civil War and the First World War, the length of track west of the Mississippi grew 900%. The famous Transcontinental Railroad had enjoyed 12 years as the only link between the eastern and the western states, but now a number of other transcontinentals were springing up to rival it. The Southern Pacific was the brainchild of the same group who had managed the Central Pacific. Keen to have a route all to themselves and needing to keep building to secure more government grants, they built along the planned southern route, through the lands of the Gadsden Purchase. In 1881, they met up with the Texas and Pacific at El Paso, near the Texas border. At the same time, they purchased the Texas-New Orleans Railway, colloquially known as the Sunset Route, which linked it with El Paso in 1883, with a silver spike ceremony held to commemorate the occasion. As well as connecting New Orleans to San Francisco, it also provided California with its first north-south trunk route. The first port it reached on the west coast was a small town called Los Angeles, which soon benefited greatly from the extra traffic the railway brought through it, growing into a thriving port city. The Central Pacific was absorbed into the Southern, which extended all the way along the west coast as far as Portland. At the same time, the rival Union Pacific was expanding across the west, most importantly purchasing the Oregon Short Line and agreeing a deal for running rights on the Oregon Railroad and Navigation, which gave them their own access to a port on the west coast. The Santa Fe Railroad was chartered in 1859 to link Santa Fe and the New Mexico Territory with cities in Kansas, but it soon set its sights on the Pacific, building over the old Santa Fe wagon trail. Bizarrely, it bypassed Santa Fe itself due to difficult terrain, connecting via a branch line later on. In 1888, they were able to purchase lines linking it to the Southern Pacific in the west, with a track-sharing agreement allowing it access to LA. In the same year, they connected to Chicago in the east, making them the easternmost of all the transcontinental companies. The Santa Fe were now the shortest link between the rail hubs in Chicago and the port in LA. And until the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, it was the longest rail route in the world, with branches all over the southwest. The Northern Pacific Railroad was actually chartered in the 1860s, around the same time that Thomas Durant was bribing his way to better land grants for the Union Pacific. But whereas the Union took years to build, the Northern Pacific took decades, due to much more demanding terrain. In recognition of this, the Northern's land grants were even more generous. By the time of completion, they would own 46 million acres, or 19.5 million hectares, more land than Missouri. Starting from Minneapolis, they had reached Bismarck, North Dakota by 1873. Here a mass financial collapse brought the project to a screeching halt. In 1881, Henry Villard, owner of the Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company, bought the Northern Pacific, having raised $8 million from investors who weren't told what they were investing in. The two companies were merged, with the Oregon taking on the name of the more prominent company. Work could now resume, with construction happening from both ends of the country. The two met in 1883 with all the usual festivities. From a business perspective, there was a unifying issue with each of these transcontinentals. They were being built through hundreds of miles of wilderness. Coast-to-coast traffic couldn't justify their running costs without intermediary customers. But to the rail companies, this wasn't much of a problem. If there was no market out west, they would create one. The companies were provided generous land grants for each mile of track built. This was the perfect place to set up new towns. To populate these new towns, adverts were placed across the eastern states, and even in Europe, calling for settlers to move out west. They gave an over-glamorized image of western settlement, presenting it as a wide-open landscape where ordinary people could escape from the drudgery of city life and make a name for themselves on the farmsteads. The reality would soon set in that the Great Plains were a harsh and arid land, and they would have to battle against the elements to make it in any way habitable. What's more, law enforcement couldn't advance as fast as the railways could, so these towns were quite rough, with attacks from outlaw gangs and from natives who were naturally not happy about having their land stolen. But advertisers could work with this too, presenting westward settlement as a great adventure. Settlers would be battling the weather, wild animals, outlaw gangs and angry natives to tame this uncivilized land. The railways effectively helped create the popular image of the Wild West. As well as a threat to settlers, the outlaw gangs were a frequent threat to the trains themselves. The rail companies were the largest private companies in the world at the time, and their trains would often be used to carry the company payroll. This could be rich pickings for those who could stop the train in an isolated spot. There was much more to be gained from robbing the company than from the passengers, meaning outlaws would typically leave passengers alone. This helped make them folk heroes, especially since the companies they were robbing were largely hated by the public anyway. Some rail companies were able to hire gunslingers for their own purposes. Mainly, this was to protect against native raids, but they could fight each other too. Where two companies wished to claim a geographic choke point, it wasn't unusual for them to send in mercenaries to firmly establish their claim. Usually, this was a relatively peaceful process. One company would make a show of strength, and the other would reroute their line accordingly. But it didn't always work this way. In 1878, the Santa Fe Railroad and the Rio Grande Railroad both laid claim to Royal Gorge in Colorado. Both sides hired teams of gunslingers to back up their claim, even as the dispute was being debated in the courts. For several months, these thugs would spy on the other company, cut telegraph lines, sabotage equipment, kidnap officials, and even break into shootouts. It is unknown if this private war claimed any lives. Finally, early in 1880, the court ruled in favour of the Rio Grande, and construction was able to proceed peacefully. But just as the railways had helped popularise the Wild West, they just as quickly killed it. They brought with them telegraph operators and law enforcers who could bring a degree of order to the frontier towns. And as towns and farms spread along the length of the railways, they served as a barrier to the native migrations and the cattle trains which had dominated the plains in their early days. Regular transcontinental travel was largely the domain of the rich. For those who emigrated out west, it would often be their one and only experience with mainline rail travel. Of more importance to them were the smaller scale projects. Networks of horse-drawn streetcars, or trams, had sprung up in nearly every American city. For common folk, they were invaluable to allow them to travel across town quickly and cheaply. People no longer had to live within walking distance of work. But as populations grew, the demand for horses grew faster than the animals could be bred. Steam wasn't an option due to the noise it would make in the inner city. The solution was a new concept known as electricity. High voltage overhead cables were strung up above routes, connected to the tram by long trolley poles. America's first electric streetcar was built in Montgomery, Alabama in 1886. There was some initial alarm at having high voltage cables hovering above the street, but it soon passed. Within 10 years, 11,000 miles or 17.8 thousand kilometres of electric tramway had been built in hundreds of places. Rail travel was changing people's lives everywhere, but not everybody could take full advantage. How much freedom black people had to travel had always varied from company to company, some allowing them to integrate freely others requiring them to travel in segregated coaches, or even boxcars. The Reconstruction era following the Civil War led to a growth in freedom, but the Compromise of 1877 showed a dramatic shift in government policy in the other direction, allowing many states to implement the Jim Crow laws, which mandated racial segregation policies in most areas of public life. As it turned out, rail companies were reluctant to impose these policies. Maintaining two separate accommodations would force them to create extra space, at expense to themselves. But pressure was piled on the railways both from the state governments and from many campaigners in the public, who insisted that black men posed a danger to white women if allowed to travel together. And so, separate white and coloured waiting rooms and carriages were introduced. In most cases, the blacks would be forced to make do with the older, battered carriages. Well, not only did this make the journey less comfortable, but their frames were much less sturdy, meaning that in an accident, they would frequently be crushed by the sturdier white carriages. Of course, not every state imposed Jim Crow laws. In much of the North and the West, blacks could travel freely. Sadly, most of the black population was in the South. Where a service covered multiple states, companies would install a removable barrier. As the train approached the border, the barrier would be put down and blacks and whites would be directed to the appropriate sides. A more welcome policy shift was in timekeeping. Since ancient times, towns had typically kept a local time, with midday set when the sun was highest. Travel between even close towns was typically measured in hours, so a few minutes difference was hardly an issue. But with the railways ideally running to a regular schedule, and the telegraph providing instant communications, minutes began to matter, and timetables became quite chaotic indeed. Much of Europe had by now adopted a single time to be followed by the whole country. But the idea was initially dismissed in America, believed to be too big for a single universal time. Instead, rail companies simplified their time management by creating company times, with each station setting its clock to match the one in the head office. However, this was far from ideal, as it gave passengers yet another timescale to keep track of. A traveller who needed to travel with two different companies in a single day would have to keep track of at least 3 local times and 2 company times. In Buffalo, there were 3 clocks outside the main station for the different companies which serviced it, along with a separate local time. As the companies now stretched all across the country, discrepancy between local time and company time could be several hours. However, efforts were ongoing internationally to create universal time zones based on the distance east and west of the Greenwich Meridian. In 1883, meteorologist Cleveland Abbe was able to persuade rail companies to adopt his proposal, which divided the mainland United States into 4 distinct time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. The initial boundaries were set along a jagged line, stringing together a series of major rail hubs. This simplified journey planning, as it meant the timetables for eastbound and westbound trains could follow the appropriate time zone. But it meant that the border of time zones was running through major populated areas. It was decided on a local level which side of the border a town should be on. Despite this, 85% of the country had adopted these time zones within a year. Finally, the government passed the Standard Time Zone Act in 1918, which mandated these time zones in every town, as well as shifting the divides to align with administrative boundaries in more rural areas. The growth of the railways in the West piled pressure on railway companies for a standardised track gauge. At the time of the Civil War, the American rail network was a patchwork of different gauges. Companies had typically built to align with whoever was closest, but this proved a problem when the companies met up. To transfer goods between companies of different gauges, rail workers had a choice between mechanically changing all the bogies over, or transshipping the entire contents of every boxcar. Either solution could take hours, and proved a particular issue in the midst of the Civil War. But the most common gauge in the North was the 4 foot 8.5 inches, or 1.435 metre Stephenson gauge. When this was selected as the gauge of the first Transcontinental Railroad, it sent a signal that this was to be the standard for the railways going forward. As standard gauge railways spread across the West, companies in the East set about regauging their lines. One major exception was in the Deep South, which had long favoured the 5 foot, or 1.53 metre Southern gauge. While some of the main lines had switched to standard gauge following the war, 11,500 miles or 18,500 kilometres of Southern gauge were still in use in 1886. But with trade from the north increasing, this was becoming unsustainable. In February that year, representatives from the South's rail companies met and agreed to set a date in which to switch everything over. Oddly, they selected the 4-foot 9-inch gauge favoured by the Pennsylvania Railroad, which has done the most contact with the South. It was close enough to be compatible with the Stephenson gauge, but a decision which ensured they would have to re-gauge it later. In the weeks leading up to the switch, companies deployed tens of thousands of workers spread out along the length of the main lines, along with all the equipment they would need. Meanwhile, the repair shops re-gauged as many of their engines and wagons as they could in advance. On the 31st of May, the network was effectively shut down for 36 hours, while the team set about lifting the rails and moving them to their new positions across thousands of miles of main lines. Competitions were held, with bonuses going to the teams who could re-gauge the most track in this time. The operation was successful, and the newly standardised main lines were able to reopen the next day, with many in the area unaware that there had even been work going on. One track gauge which remained semi-popular was the narrow gauge, which was much cheaper to build and to run, and could wind through rough mountainous areas much more easily. The Rio Grande Railroad in Colorado built over 2,000 miles or 3,200 kilometres over the course of the 1880s, inspiring similar projects all across the country, allowing sparsely populated areas to have a profitable connection to the main network. At its peak, there were around 12,000 miles or 19,000 kilometres of narrow gauge in the US. The 1880s in general saw increased calls for overall government oversight. One prominent group calling for nationwide oversight were farmers. They had increasingly been of the view that the larger rail companies were exploiting the monopoly they held over transportation of goods in a region to set extortionate rates. In fact, rates were generally regulated by competition. The fact that many services were operating at a loss suggests the rail companies were setting a fair price. But it was hard to deny that the stranglehold they held over transportation allowed them to regularly exert their influence on the governments. To a growing number of industries, the railways simply had too much power and too little oversight. In the 1870s, the farmers formed the Granger movement to campaign for standardised freight rates, among other things. They successfully lobbied several states to introduce these laws, but this was no good for those who required freight to be transported elsewhere. Change was required on a national level. The Grangers argued that efficient transportation of goods was vital for just about every part of the economy, and shouldn't be throttled by profiteering rail companies. Their movement got a boost thanks to a series of high-profile accidents from around this time. In 1887, the Toledo, Peoria and Western Railroad conducted a controlled burn on dry fields near their line to prevent engine sparks starting a wildfire. But their burn weakened a wooden bridge. As a train was passing over it later that evening, the bridge collapsed. Though the engine made it to the other side, all 6 passenger carriages were telescoped together. 84 people were killed and 280 injured. A year later, a procession of 8 excursion trains from the Catholic Total Abstinence Union were passing through Mud Run Station, Pennsylvania, at 10-minute intervals. But a danger signal required the 6th train to stop just outside the station, with a bend behind it making it hard to see. The guard went to set up a warning to the rear, but he did not know that regulations required one to be set up at a distance of 16 telegraph poles to the rear, when he'd only gone 4. The net result was that the 7th train didn't realise the danger in time and smashed into the 6th, smashing the rear carriages to pieces. 64 people were killed and 50 injured. These accidents strengthened calls for stronger safety standards in American railways. Up until this point, regulations were set by the state governments. Features such as continuous brakes and block signalling had been mandated in some states but not others. This patchwork of regulations was all well and good when companies largely operated on the local level, but with the bigger companies now stretching over dozens of states, it gave them lots of wiggle room to get around regulations. The Granger's successor, the Farmers' Alliance, formed with multiple groups to create the Populist movement, campaigning for stronger government oversight, standard freight rates and standard regulations. In fact, many rail companies backed their cause. To them, standard freight rates would eliminate the pressure of competition. Standard regulations would greatly simplify the bureaucracy, since they would have only one set of laws to worry about, rather than different laws for every state they serviced. And better safety standards would allow them to run faster and more frequent services with less fear of accidents. It was with this in mind that the Interstate Commerce Commission was formed in 1887 to act as an independent government agency to oversee the railways and impose legislation. However, the ICC would have a decidedly mixed effect on the railways going forward. But that is a story for next time. Thank you all for watching this omnibus edition of my American Rail History series. I add to it every time there is a new video out. If you're enjoying this series so far, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to let the YouTube algorithm know. And if you would like to support this channel further, I have links below to my website and my Etsy pages, as well as my merch shop where I sell my drawings. I'm currently working on the next part of this series, which should be with you in the next couple of months. In the meantime, why not check out the rest of my channel? I hope to see you soon.